Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we continue the conversation from the other day. Coming out of the NBA Cup, this Bucks team that continues to pick up some momentum. How much momentum is Giannis's MVP case picked up now? We get into that conversation and take a look at the Eastern Conference next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined by Camille Davis and Frank Madden. We thank you for making this your first listen of the day and for checking out the Locked On Bucks newsletter. Start your day with the all-new free Locked On Bucks newsletter. If you have not already, sign up for free at lockedondaily.com. That is lockedondaily.com. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So on yesterday's show, we talked about that NBA Cup victory, what it means for this team, how you can continue to move forward against the Cleveland Cavaliers, who you have your next game against, one of those teams in front of you in the standings. And one way to do that is for Giannis to continue playing like he has of late. Camille and I have talked about this. I've talked about it on the radio as well, Frank. I would assume you feel pretty similar, if not the same. There's a number of things to point to for this turnaround in the unofficial 13-3 record in their last 16 games. The young guys and the sparks that Andre Jackson and AJ Green have given you, guys are starting to hit shots. Doc Rivers, I think, has done a pretty good job. Like, there's a lot you can point to, but none of it matters, or at least moves the needle enough if Giannis is not playing like this. Like, you're not going 13-3. You know, maybe you win 9 games during that stretch, but not like this. And he has now slowly and quietly started to reemerge with people who shunned him and left him out of the discussion early. Still too early to get into. But now all of a sudden, hey, maybe Giannis is the number 2 guy to look at for MVP. And you're starting to see a lot of that discussion of, yeah, Giannis is in the mix with 3 or so other guys, with the caveat that it's December. You probably can't really start to vet MVP candidates until you get to late January, February. How strong of a case do you think he has? The question to both of you guys.
I mean, well, I guess we'll find out how the rest of the media feels. I believe later this week. Tim
straw poll, yeah,
referenced the MVP straw poll that he runs for ESPN. I believe coming out this week.
It was very cryptic and made it sound like, hey, you're going to be surprised that Giannis is getting a lot more mention.
Yeah, and again, it wasn't. And I assume that implication was that people were waiting until like the voting was happening after the NBA Cup final, which would make sense, obviously, given that, yes, it doesn't count for official stats, but of course it's the single
Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and the guys
against Giannis,
it's the single most consequential game in terms of stakes in the first 2 months of the season. So of course, and I do think it's interesting to see how players react in under the microcosm of a single elimination, Final Four championship game style tournament, because we don't have that in the NBA. This is the only thing. So I would guess Giannis will be second and probably have, and probably not all that distant. I think he will probably not be ahead of Nikola Jokić at this point. Although Jokić has, last couple of games has come down a bit back down to earth. I mean, he was averaging close to 30 points.
Came down from scoring 100 points over.
And 50% from 3.
Yeah, I mean, he's still at, basically 31 points, 13 or 14 rebounds, and almost 10 assists a game. So it's like we can quote Giannis's incredible stat line, but Jokić also has an absolutely absurd stat line, right? Like, if we saw these stat lines that both these guys are putting up when we were kids, can you imagine seeing those stat lines and being like, yeah, NBA players are going to be averaging this? Would be like, He's the greatest players of all time, you know. And then if someone told you that one of those dudes would play for the Bucks,
right?
Like, you know,
and the other one plays for the Denver Nuggets.
Yeah,
what?
I mean, that would have been the Vince McMahon, you know, basically like, you know, someone's going to average, you know, 32 points, blah blah blah, and I would just be like me, and then finally like, you know, feeling over in my chair when you tell me that the Bucks are going to win a championship, right? So yeah, I think he'll probably finish second. And I don't know. I mean, to be honest, I mean, it happens every year. There's always, like, between these top candidates, like the fan bases, you know, pick their talking points against the other guys. And so, you know, with Giannis versus Jokić, it's always obviously the defensive impact that Giannis makes, which I think it was a huge storyline from Vegas over both games, and even going before that too. I mean, Orlando as well, and just the last month. You know, yeah, it's been most obvious in Giannis' shot blocking stats, but you know, I think we've talked about it, how we really hope that we could maybe see the return of, you know, all defensive team level Giannis, and we've been saying for a few weeks now that we've actually been seeing that type of impact about the way he's made defenses or offenses feel him from a defensive standpoint. And again, the all defensive stuff is very, you know, yes, there's some metrics that people will look at. People look at team defense as well. I think it's another reason why I really hope the Bucks can become a top 10 defense, because I think it helps Giannis and, of course, Brook, although I think Brook would be more of a long shot, but helps those guys candidacies as all defensive team guys, and also Giannis and his MVP candidacy. But you know, just some obviously just massively signature plays over those two games in Vegas from Giannis, that when people go to vote for all defense and for MVP, people are going to look back on those games and say, how many people, you know, can make the plays that Giannis makes on both ends of the floor? And of course the answer is, you know, I don't know, a couple, you know, like, I mean, I don't know anybody else who's made has a combination of like the chase down blocks and those recovery shot blocks at the rim that Giannis has. I mean, he is one of one. And so I think the more if you're a Bucks fan, you know, the more you can get defense being a part of the MVP conversation. That is, you know, in the spirit of just having an election where we had debates and talking points. I think for the MVP this year, the more you can make this, you know, a two-way debate and talk about two-way basketball, and I thought MVPs were based on what they did on both ends of the court, right? Like, we're going to see a lot of that, I'm sure. I'm expecting to fully see from some of our favorite Bucks video accounts. They're going to put together Jokić low-light reels on defense, things of that nature. And on some level, I find it a little bit toxic, because I think Jokić is awesome, and it feels like kind of a waste to be arguing when they're not, you know, in the same conference and they don't play the same position and all that. But you know, whatever, it is what it is. And compared to, you know, what things could be, I'm just thankful that, knock on wood, Giannis is healthy, trending to be eligible still for the MVP, which is itself a challenge, right? Like, any of these guys, if they get, you know, a month-long injury, could just be ineligible, you know, basically fall out of eligibility with the 65 game rule. So I think he's firmly placed himself in the mix. And, you know, I'll leave it to you guys to talk a little more. I know, Justin, we've talked about the importance of the Bucks finishing top three, maybe top two, but probably top three is realistic. They need to get. And certainly, like, the relative rankings important, because obviously Denver has had their challenges as well, and the vibes have not been great in Denver. So again, so much of MVP stuff is vibes and narrative, and we're kind of at the high point, a local high point at this point, you know, at this stage, with Giannis just coming off a really memorable week. And again, like, you can say, like, over his last games he's put up X. Well, and then you look at his regular season full season numbers, and it's like the same crap. Like, it's ridiculous all year. So you just cross your fingers and hope that he stays healthy. And if he does, he's going to be right in that mix, and it's going to be team success, you know, vibes, narrative, and a few other things. And hopefully he just keeps doing what we know he's capable of.
Camille, we'll get your straw poll after the break of, and we touched on the defense. That is, I suppose the most important part for Giannis' candidacy, even though he has consistently been this guy offensively, but the defense changes that we've seen there. We'll get into that conversation coming up next year on Locked On Bucks. This next episode of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Prize Picks, the best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, Prize Picks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. All you have to do is pick more or less on at least two players for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your cash. Run your game all season long on Prize Picks, America's #1 daily fantasy sports app. You can make your holidays bigger and brighter with Prize Picks, the best place to get real money action while watching your favorite sports. You sign up today and get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It is guaranteed. So if you think Steph Curry will get more than 5 3-pointers next week, or maybe Giannis will get more than 35 points, cook up hot takes with your friends and win real money this season when you and your crew run your game on Prize Picks. Download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNBA to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That code again, LOCKEDONNBA, and get $50 instantly after playing your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. Today's episode is brought to you by Rocket RX. If you're ready to boost your confidence and take control in the bedroom, Rocket RX has the solution. Imagine feeling more prepared and performing at your best. Rocket RX makes it simple and stress-free. Rocket RX offers FDA-approved treatments for erectile dysfunction at a lower cost than branded alternatives. No more uncomfortable doctor visits or pharmacy trips. Everything is delivered straight to your door in discreet, plain packaging. With Rocket RX, you'll get trusted care from a real U.S. clinical team. Complete a quick 100% online consultation, and you could get your free prescription today. Visit rocketrx.com to get started now. It only takes 2 minutes. Right now, our listeners can get 40% off your first order when you use the code LOCKEDONNBA. That's rocketrx.com, code LOCKEDONNBA for 40% off your first order. Terms and conditions apply. Rocket RX, better sex made simple. So, Frank, you think he's going to finish second when the Tim Bontemps straw poll comes out relatively soon here. I still think it's going to be third, that he's going to be behind Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Jokić. Camille, what about you?
I think that based on how Tim was kind of alluding to being some surprises, he might be one because people do tend to be a little bit prisoner of the moment a lot of the times. And if you look at what the Bucks have been doing over the last 15 games, as we have mentioned, I think there's a really strong case to say, like, right now, Giannis has been the MVP of the league for the first month and a half of the season. One of the critiques against Giannis's MVP candidacy for the last few years, I've thought is because, like, he's been consistently excellent. And the question is like, well, what has he been doing differently? Everyone has been waiting for so long for Giannis to develop that 3-point shot. For the longest time, that was the piece of his game where people were like, once he adds that, he's going to be lethal. It's over. It's done for. And that hasn't come. Matter of fact, it's been the complete opposite with him taking like the least amount of threes in his career, still keeping the same rim attempts up as Frank has pointed out before. But that mid-range piece of it all and how efficient that he's been at that shot. I think that one of the biggest shots he hit in that game against Thunder was that fading mid-range shot of just like, okay, like, again, this is in the bag now. And a lot of the narratives around MVP, it's like, well, what did you add to your game? What are you doing differently now that you weren't doing before that we should be paying attention to because it's fantastic. He's still putting up crazy efficiency numbers, shooting over 60% from the field, while averaging over 30 points per game, averaging a career high in points per game right now. And he's doing that while adding to that mid-range shot where he's taken the 4th most attempts from mid-range in the NBA while shooting 46%. Like, that's a better mid-range average than Kevin Durant, than Paul George, Jamal Murray. Like, he has added something to his game that people, I think, can point to and tangibly say, like, hey, he's added to his game in this way. You pair that in with what he's been doing defensively and the consistency that he's been having offensively. He hasn't had a game, I believe, under 50% from the field so far. So, like, when you think of all those aspects, if the Bucks can finish, I think, looking end of season, if he continues shooting that mid-range shot, continue the defensive effort, and you get to the Bucks being a top 4 seed in the East, like, once you get to that point, I think the case is really, really strong for Giannis.
I think what's somewhat remarkable too is I don't remember if it was with you, Camille, or Frank, but earlier in this season, mentioning too, I brought it up of the way things are looking defensively. Like, do you just have to basically say, okay, Giannis, I know you're capable of doing these things offensively, but we need you to be the defensive guy. So Damian Lillard's going to carry a lot of the offense, and you're going to be the Giannis of old defensively. He has been the Giannis of old defensively, at least during this 16-game run here. And he's been even better offensively than he was a season ago. So that's not the road that they went down. But the defense, to that point you made earlier, Frank, like, that's what's going to really open the door. The Bucks obviously continuing to play much better and finishing up there in the standings, at least home court. But his defense is what's going to set him apart from the rest of those guys. So I know it's been a touchy subject with some Bucks fans that weren't willing to hear it at times, and you would tout Giannis's defense even when it had kind of slipped the last couple of years. How would we even word this? Like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much would you say his defense has improved or returned to that form this season?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think it's more about just the consistent impact. It just felt like there were a lot of games where, especially good teams, like when you look at Giannis's box score and he doesn't have a steal or a block, I don't think that it's not like the lack of individual steals or blocks is the issue. I think those are indicators, though, of the fact that good teams, these last couple of years in particular, I think at times found ways to keep him away from the ball, out of plays, and perhaps part of it too, especially 2 years ago when he was, carrying like the highest usage load of his career. He just had to pick his spots more and just wasn't as engaged defensively. So again, I also think on some level you need to be careful, like to not. I mean, of course, like, you can't use just the highlight reel plays as indicative of what he's doing every time down the floor, but I think realistically as well, he is an incredible clutch defender, and it's weird to think of defense in that respect because we don't think of defense like shot making where you're having to play under pressure and, when it's clutch situations, like you just can't perform as well, right? Like that's not generally how you think about defense. But something about Giannis, leads him to be able to lock in ways defensively that other guys just don't seem to. And some of the incredible highlight plays that we've seen from him when, it matters the most, I think, is great for his candidacy because defensive player, he's I'm not going to say he's a defensive player candidate at this point quite yet. I don't think the team stats are there. His on-off numbers certainly don't support that, but those things can be very noisy. But I think certainly the MVP candidacy, the all-defensive candidacy, when he's making those blocks and how he's making them matter a lot. And I think those are going to, weigh on the minds of voters, right? And that's a big reason why I'm thinking that, he's probably at this point the at least number 2 guy in terms of MVP candidacy. But I think the other piece too is just, yes, I think the Bucks have to, certainly finish higher than the Nuggets in terms of record and standing and all that. But I think it's also, again, just sort of the intangible thing, right? If it feels like at the end of the year, maybe the Bucks are a 4 seed, but are the Bucks playing or have they played in a way where it feels like, man, Bucks are, trendy favorite to be an upset team that could take down the Celtics or whatever, right? Again, does that stuff matter in the grand scheme of the universe? No. The media's opinions of what might happen really aren't that important. And in some ways, they can be a bit of a curse because they set expectations very high. But I think if that's the way people are perceiving the Bucks at the end of the season, I think that does help Giannis's potential MVP candidacy if he legitimizes the Bucks as contenders, and it feels like, the record they've put together is reflective of a team that, is dominant and honestly worthy of being an MVP. So yeah, I mean, I think it's all interlinked. But I think defensively, he has kind of gotten back to a level that, we really hadn't seen for probably a few years. And it's just awesome to see, because I think guys don't usually guys don't become better defenders as they get older. Right. I'm not sure Giannis is a better defender now than he was, at his peak or something like that. Yeah. But he's still a dominant defender, still an all defensive caliber defender. And, I don't know, maybe the Brook Lopez, aging tonic or something Giannis has gotten tapped into, because Brook is probably the best example of a guy who actually got better, when he got older defensively. Hey, if Giannis can get some of that going, then sky's the limit. But at a minimum, if you can just sort of stay at the level that he's been here, you certainly have to feel optimistic about where the Bucks defense is going. And also give credit. People talked about, oh, well, Drew Holiday made Brook Lopez and Giannis look better, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Andre Jackson, to a lesser extent, AJ Green, some of these other guys in the defensive effort that they're putting in on the wings and at the point of attack, go ahead and say that's also making the big guys look better in the interior as well.
Speaking of some of those names, Camille, I have a question for both of you guys and the conference as a whole, kind of what we started to mention earlier about the Bucks and still pretty far off, but once we get to the end of the year, how are things starting to look? We'll get into that conversation coming up next. Time to talk to you about our friends over at FanDuel who have gotten ready to tackle the NFL action, and you should too with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So, Camille, who would you say is the second best defender on the team?
My mind is torn. Like, my first two thoughts came like it's between Brook Lopez there, and then it's Andre Jackson Jr., where it's like, which one of their impacts do I want to lean to more of, like, you need this? Because we've talked so much about how the better the perimeter or point of attack defender is, the easier it's going to make life for Brook Lopez to be in his spots to help the defenders. And then other side of that is like, okay, but then you have your Brook Lopez back there. It's like, well, how much freedom does having Brook Lopez behind you as a point of attack defender give you, knowing, okay, I can play aggressive because if I do mess up or someone gets behind me, I got Big Brook behind me. So it's hard for me to pick between those two. But if I had to pick one of the two, I would think I would go with Andre Jackson Jr. Just because of how desperately the Bucks have needed a strong point of attack defender and how important that is to have for the entire system. And for Andre, we saw the flashes last year. We could tell that there was something there with him. It was just that he found it difficult to stay on the court because of the fouling trouble. And he's been able to rectify that a bit this season, and his impact has been huge. I haven't checked the defensive numbers for him lately, but when I last checked, the numbers were saying like he is the Bucks' most impactful defender on the court. So I would lean Andre Jackson Jr., but it's between him and Brook Lopez for sure for me for that second spot.
Yeah, and I just looked at the same thing, Camille, like the on-off numbers, especially defensively, just to see what it was. Not long ago, probably a week or two ago, Andre was #1. Yeah. Now Brook is #1 on the Bucks in that stat. Yeah. So the Bucks are 10 points per 100 better with Brook on the floor versus off. Andre's at 6, so also I think reflective of the positive impact that he's had. You look at the top on-off guys overall, offense and defense. AJ Green now +9 points per 100 on-off differential. +6 offense, plus or 3 points better defensively. Brook second, +8. Andre +6 overall. So yeah, I think those are absolutely the two guys. I don't think it's close that anybody else would be in that discussion. And like you said, Camille, I think it's pretty hard to choose because they are very complementary. I mean, it's peanut butter and jelly.
Yeah.
The point of attack defender excelling makes Brook Lopez look better. Brook Lopez also makes everybody else look better. I would say for that reason, I would still put Brook in that category. I think Andre certainly has all the potential in the world to become, an absolutely like top elite upper echelon, all defensive caliber wing defender. You could argue small sample, he already is. I think part of I'd like to see more is just being able to show that he can do it playing 25, 30 minutes every night and not, and I realize he's not getting his minutes cut in certain games because of his defense.
Yeah.
But exactly. But you got to be able to, I think, I don't have his minutes in front of me right now, but, if you're not playing big minutes load, I think it's hard to be as impactful a defender, right? And Brook's over 30 minutes per game. So I'll give it to Brook in part because I think Brook makes other guys better defensively all around the floor versus Andre. I think definitely helps Brook, helps the defense overall, but I don't think a small guy is just quite as impactful as a defensive guy. I think, the data over very long periods of time suggests typically the bigger you are, it's typically something that makes you a bit more impactful defensively. But, having to choose between those guys is a nice problem to have.
Yes, it is.
Andre's at 18 minutes a game, which is still double what it was a year ago. And to your point, we still see a handful of those games where it's, oh man, Andre, he only played 8 minutes today because sometimes the offense just becomes too much of an issue. But there's no denying the defense. And I think it speaks volumes too, to we're at least having a conversation of, well, this guy's the best defender. Who is the second best? And there's more than one option, which is think about how far removed that was from a year ago when we were having those types of conversations. But it brings us to the last thing I want to touch on of the Eastern Conference as a whole. And look, I'll preface with, it is never as bad as it seems. It is never as good as it currently feels. So it's always going to be somewhere in the middle. But what stands out to me is we started the season with the Bucks in a 2-8 hole, and you looked at the Celtics and the Cavs running away with things, and you just wonder, like, man, is this it? And looking around at the East, all the moves that were made in the offseason too, one of the things I know all of us talked about on this show was especially with teams like the Knicks. Well, we experienced that last year when you just totally changed your identity. Maybe you're going to win games, but you go from one type of team to another. It's never a seamless transition. And those wins oftentimes are coming because of your talent, that it's a process to really learn the new personnel and figure out what is our actual identity now. Like the Knicks are winning. It's not a Tibbs team. There's a lot of questions on the defensive end. You look at other teams that have really started to emerge, like the Orlando Magic, a very, very good team, but I understand their top two scorers are out right now, and it doesn't sound like Paolo Banchero is anywhere close to returning from the latest updates. It still feels like a team that is really going to struggle to score the ball in the playoffs. I think when you look at the Cavs, as good as they've started, the last few years, it's largely the same group. There has always been some questions about the personnel fit when you get to the playoffs. So the point of all of it is, other than the Celtics, and I think you can start to put the Bucks in this group, other than the Celtics, there's no other team that you would look at and say, well, not really sure what the clear weakness is with this group, like what spot you would look at to exploit it. And that's where it's always, to me, been like, just figure this out and just start to get better, find what you do well, really focus in on that, improve your weaknesses, because there are teams in front of you in the standings and there are teams that are winning, but like all of those teams have their share of questions.
Yeah, they do. I think the Knicks is a really good one to pick because they're a team where you expect to know how they play based on who they are, who they're coached by, the pieces that they have there, but it hasn't necessarily gone that way. Like the offense, fantastic. The defense,
the Knicks have been like a Zillow gone wild.
Right, like they're still trying to find it. Like they thought that Bridges could come in and really be like their point of attack defender, be really solid. And quicker guards have been eating that matchup up. So like they've they thought a strength is it's actually turning out to be not an area of a strength anymore. It's like, okay, we have to kind of figure this out, because the beauty of having OG in New York is like you can kind of use him as a pseudo help defender. He can play on bigger wings and all that stuff. And OG's been able to do that, but the Bridges part hasn't come together. So like when you look at the teams that are ahead of the Bucks in the standings, and even by like how many games, like the Bucks are 14-11. The Magic are 17-11. The Knicks are 16-10. So it's a lot of season left to be played still, and you're right there with them because of the status of how the Eastern Conference has been, which was my saving grace early on when the Bucks were 2-8. At that time, there were two teams above 500 in the East early on in the season. So like everyone was still trying to figure it out. The hope I have for the Bucks going forward, though, in this landscape of the East is like take advantage of your schedule now. Because from now until I believe the beginning of February, they only play a handful of teams with winning records at this point. So like take care of business there, because once that calendar turns, I believe into March, it gets really, really difficult for this Bucks team. So like continue to rack up those wins when you have these more marquee matchups like they do on Friday here against the Cavaliers, like use it as a measuring stick, but just keep taking care of business and building along the way, because looking at the standings, you're not that far out of climbing back into like a top 3 spot potentially.
Yeah, the Knicks are so interesting. I mean, I think people, I mean, I think at the time when they lost Hartenstein, I thought that was a huge loss.
I did too.
Because you just think about their whole identity. I mean, the most I watched them was in the playoffs last year, and just their identity with Hartenstein and Robinson was so much based around just being able to just bludgeon you to death. You know, Josh Hart too, like they just crashed the offensive glass. They were so big, physicality, etc. And
the Hartenstein and Brunson pick and roll too, and his ability as basically a hub offensively.
Yeah, and which we saw, early in the Cup final game as well. And so to go from that to Cat, who's obviously everybody would say, well, Cat's a better player than Isaiah Hartenstein. But, if people are surprised by a Tibbs team being kind of inverted in terms of their strengths, we shouldn't be, because the last time that Tibbs coached Cat, they had the fourth best offense. I think it was in 2018-19, I want to say.
Yep.
They had the fourth best offense. They had the 27th ranked defense, and, they were fine. This was when Jimmy Butler was on with Andrew Wiggins and that whole group. So, which I think also goes back to kind of my point earlier about Brook Lopez and why a guy like Brook as the center is so important to the overall defense, because of what a center can do to kind of prop up and provide a defensive foundation. With Cat, it's obviously the opposite. Like, you can put all the great wing defenders you want around a shaky center defensively. It's going to be hard to just be elite defensively, and I think we've seen teams, the Nuggets, I think, have done a solid job. Like, they're below average this year, but they've done a pretty good job putting, some defensive guys like obviously Aaron Gordon and KCP when he was there, to try to compensate for some of the limitations of, Jokić and to an extent MPJ. But yeah, I mean, you're never going to be great defensively with a poor defensive center. Really, the Rockets are probably the biggest exception to that. I think Şengün has his moments defensively. I think he, certainly is going to have his problems if he's isolated one-on-one with smaller players. But I've seen him make some plays and some blocks and things like that at times as well. But for the most part, they've figured out how to. Well,
and they can get around it because Tari Eason can defend up, and Jabari Smith Jr. can take on some of those assignments too. Yeah.
So I don't know. It's tough to say. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, it'll be interesting to see if we revisit this conversation, in 30 games, because the Cavs had an incredible hot streak last year as well. It just came later in the season after they'd had.
Became like starting right now, basically.
Right. Yeah. So they had a
terrible injury too.
Yeah, they had a slow start, and then they had injuries, and then they got really good when they had injuries, and then when they got healthy, then they again kind of went back to being meh. So, I mean, I guess they can be happy about the fact that they haven't had the swoon yet, or at least not a major one. And, I think you feel better that the team that's constructed can kind of make sense together. And Mobley has, kind of shown signs of not making a huge leap, but, he had like that 41-point game and he had 4 points next game. So it's like, it's kind of still up and down with him. I wasn't really that impressed. Well, knock on wood here. I really wasn't that impressed with him the 2 times the Bucks played them earlier this season. I mean, he's really good defensively, but offensively, like, okay, he can beat up on Bobby Portis for a couple minutes.
He can dunk, yeah.
He can dunk, but his 3-point shooting is better, but doesn't shoot many of them. So I think Cleveland, I think, is still a little bit TBD, and as you said, with Orlando with the injuries and all that, it still feels like a team that is probably going to be prone to rock fights.
They're not going to be fun to play in the playoffs, but it's like the Bucks of old, where it's like, great, you've gotten stop after stop after stop, but when are you going to score?
Yeah, so we'll see. But I mean, this is just kind of one of those things. Like, you just hope the Bucks don't. You just hope they don't let off the gas, right? That they feel like, okay, we're legitimized, we're fine. It's the East, And I don't know, Justin. I'm not sure. You being around the team, I don't know to what extent you've. I mean, they've dug themselves such a hole. There's been like no real time to be talking about like, well, we're not worried about seeding. We just want to get to the playoffs. Like,
yeah,
it's almost like they haven't really had the breathing room to discuss that kind of thinking. I know, a couple of years ago when they won 58 games, they were very open about wanting, the 1 seed.
The 1 seed, yeah.
And obviously they never got a chance to use it against the Celtics in a subsequent round. So I don't know. I don't know exactly where they are at this point now, but certainly they have not had the luxury of resting Giannis a bunch. He's literally been on the injury report every game.
Yeah.
And so it would be nice if they could get to the point where maybe they could be a little bit more judicious and think long term. But obviously to date, they've been kind of just forced to worry about the next game, So we'll see. And at 14-11, it's not like they have some big buffer. As you said, they're still very close to some of those teams ahead of them.
Still close to 7 or 8, yeah.
Yeah.
That too.
I mean, it hasn't, you kind of mentioned it hasn't really been a discussion because of that. Like, the only thing that's really been openly discussed, and like, this isn't just now in the 13 and wins in those 16 games played since. This was even during the 2-8 start, was from Doc, from Bobby Portis, a number of guys that I wouldn't say the message was we're not worried, but it was like, we trust this group, and the vibes were good coming in. The vibes are still good. We're not pointing fingers. Like Doc said a couple of times too, like, guys, what I see that we're working on in practice, a run is going to come really soon. I can tell that this group kind of stayed to that message. So we've talked about it on this show before. It's a big credit to Doc Rivers.
Truly.
I understand the checkered past and his playoff history. It's there, and it's not anything you can run from. And you're going to have a group of people that are automatically out on Doc Rivers because of that. But I do think Doc Rivers has been arguably the perfect coach for this group because of his ability to manage those guys, and just keeping them focused on that and not letting this locker room fracture. And he's talked about it too. He's experienced that in the past, and that was, I think, one of the biggest draws to this Bucks job was, I got a bunch of adults that don't really have any of that drama that they're bringing with them. So that's a welcome change from some of those locker rooms that I had in the past. But look, as we said throughout both of these shows, we feel great now, but you lose to the Cavs, and then all of a sudden it's they got to fix this, and this. So we'll see how things go later on today. But that is certainly a big one with the Cavaliers. And as I think we all agree to mention, if you can win this game tonight, regardless of how you do it, that is a more impressive win than beating the Oklahoma City Thunder, because you're carrying it over. And, at some point there's going to be a letdown, but it wasn't in one of those big spots. So we will find out later on tonight in a big one, the Bucks and the Cavaliers from Cleveland. That will do it for today's show, though. For Camille and Frank, I'm Justin. We will talk to you guys once again next week on Locked On Bucks.